Sunday morning. The Galilean camp erupted into a fury of activity at first light. There was extra packing to be done after the weekend stop. Older travellers were anxious about climbing the long and hazardous Jericho road, and the young ones were excited at the prospect of entering the holy city of Jerusalem by the end of the day. Jesus, having almost nothing to pack, acquired a small audience of young children who'd escaped from their stressed parents. He was well into a dramatised retelling of the story of Jonah, the part where the escaping prophet sinks deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the angry ocean. I remember that day only too well, and it didn't feel very entertaining at the time. When Thomas and Simon arrived with a delegation of irate parents and tried to shoo the children away. Above parental cries of, "So that's where you've been, you little jackal," Thomas took control of the situation and announced, "Children, the teacher has very important things on his mind and he could do without you pestering him. Now please leave him in peace." Jesus was indignant. Wait, he called, trying to stop the parents from dragging their offspring back into the family arguments. "Please let the children stay with me and don't take them away. My Father's kingdom belongs to children just like these." The parents were, in fact, only too happy to leave their little ones in Jesus' impromptu creche while they returned to adult concerns. Thomas and Simon remained rather sheepishly at the back. "The fact is," Jesus continued, looking at his two followers, "unless you welcome my Father's kingdom like a child does, you will never enter it." The two men carefully sat themselves cross-legged on the ground. The children watched disinterestedly and then turned back to Jesus, who slowly raised both his arms high in the air and suddenly flung them downward, saying a very loud splash. The whale had arrived. As Jesus' story reached its conclusion, his audience had grown both in size and average age. The account of how those ancient enemies of the Jews, the people of Nineveh, had turned to God in prayer and humility gave the travellers a faint hope that even the cruel might of the Roman Empire could be broken by the words of a great prophet. Almost without exception, the adults looked at Jesus, seated in a ring of enthralled children, and wondered if just such a miracle might take place this year in Jerusalem. A voice came from the back of the crowd, a clear, young, cultured voice. "Good teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life?" Heads turned to identify the questioner. It was Josephus, Jesus' host from last night. He glowed with enthusiasm as he stood upright, awaiting a reply. To see one of the law-bound Pharisees so openly associating himself with Jesus was an interesting development. The significance was not lost on the cynical Galileans. I too wondered whether this might lead to a change in our plan. Perhaps, I thought, if Josephus and his 4 friends were to throw in their lot with Jesus, our journey to Jerusalem might have a different end to the one we expected. With my boss, stories often take unexpected turns. Jesus showed himself to be his Father's son with an unexpected reply. "Why'd you call me good?" he asked. "Surely only God is utterly good." My bubble of anticipation popped. I looked into Jesus' mind and saw there the image of a great fruit tree bearing one solitary blossom. I understood his thought. The blooming of one flower comes a long time before the celebrations of a safely gathered harvest. Josephus did not answer Jesus' question. He was startled that his modestly flattering term of address could be treated so harshly. Jesus reminded him of the 10 Commandments, and Josephus replied, as any self-respecting Pharisee would, that he had kept them all his life. The children fiddled with pebbles in the dirt, and the adults watched the wealthy Pharisee cautiously while Jesus measured his reply. "There's just one thing you lack," he spoke clearly and with authority. We waited to hear what it might be that this wealthy and well-educated man might still need. Go home. Sell everything you own. Give all the money to the poor, and then come with me. Josephus stood as if frozen. He thought of his bright children and beautiful wife, and the adrenaline which had flooded his veins froze too. But still in his heart there was warm faith. Jesus spoke again into that lingering glow. You will have treasures in heaven. Icy fear prevailed. Josephus couldn't do it. Too many things held him to his present life. He knew very well what was awaiting Jesus at the end of his day's walk in Jerusalem. He could not risk being part of it. He turned round and walked home. The Galileans returned to their packing, and Jesus watched the proud young Pharisee disappear into the tangled weeds of wealth and privilege. He knew that they would never meet again, ever, and that knowledge made him very sad. Later in the morning, when everyone was ready to leave, Jesus strode out ahead with his 12 loyal followers. Many of the travellers saw in him the marks of a leader and imagined the day when he might lead a Jewish militia to victory against Rome. Archangel Michael, on the other hand, saw danger. The Jericho to Jerusalem road is notorious bandit country. The steep and twisting track gives ample opportunity for thieves to attack cash-laden travellers heading for the city. By striding out ahead, Jesus would be making himself an easy target once he reached the hills. Michael asked me for permission to clear the road of any dangers. I considered the possibilities and allowed him to neutralise any common thieves, but only common thieves. If the religious leaders or the opposition have laid any kind of trap or ambush, you must let it be, I insisted. What about leopards or mountain lions? Michael inquired. I smiled and said nothing. Michael took his small force away, and I joined Jesus, who asked, Oriel, how should I enter Jerusalem? I'm not sure. Aren't you going to walk? I asked, not entirely understanding the question. Human minds judge a great many things by how they look, he observed. The way they see me enter their city will have a considerable influence on what they do next. How would the ordinary people like you to do it? I probed. Well, you know that better than me. You hear their thoughts and see their spirits. The Galileans want you to ride on a war horse with a spear in your hand, I replied. Jesus was thoughtful. The Jewish and Roman leaders want me to arrive anonymously in the crowd and to remain so. He walked silently, replaying the two images in his mind. Well, that is 2 possibilities ruled out, he concluded. Can you not do what you're doing now? I asked. Walk on ahead with your disciples. It'd show you to be independent and in the lead and strong, but not looking for a battle. It would also make it very easy for them to arrest me there and then, and I'm not ready for that. Then Jesus simply closed his mind to the issue. He looked down at his feet and thought only of walking and of the road, focusing on the sensation of each bump and dip in the well-worn track. I withdrew and joined the 12. They too were discussing what impression Jesus would make on the people of Jerusalem. As the lowland town of Jericho came into view, Jesus stopped and waited for his companions. They could see he had something to tell them. When we get to Jerusalem, he began, everything written about the Son in the Scriptures will be fulfilled. He will be handed over to the Romans. They will laugh at him, insult him, attack him, and eventually they will kill him. The group walked on in silence for some distance. The disciples didn't know who Jesus meant by the Son, and Jesus didn't attempt to explain. And on the 3rd day, he will rise again. The disciples still walked on, wondering what their leader was trying to tell them. I too was wondering what the leader of the opposition would make of such an announcement. He's been plotting Jesus' death for so long. How would he react to hear the Son predict his own demise so plainly? The midday rest. The morning's walk had been fast and flat, a straight road through the fertile fields of the Jordan plain. The travellers made their last pause before the sheer hard work of their annual climb up and up into the Judean mountains. Somewhere up there, Michael and his team were searching the caves and crevices for potential danger. Meanwhile, down here, the morning ended with the feel of a carnival. The Jerusalem road runs through the middle of Jericho, a prosperous town that has grown rich on the passing trade. The people of Jericho, who pride themselves on being quite different from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, were pleased to crowd into the street and welcome Jesus. Any Jew distrusted by Jerusalem is a friend in Jericho, and they knew well enough that the authorities in the capital were looking to arrest the Galilean teacher. As the long line of pilgrims approached the city, it became clear that Jesus' arrival was anticipated. Workers in the field left their tools and crossed to the road to shake his hand and wish him well. The nearer they came to the town, the more often this happened, and we saw several people sprint ahead to tell of his coming. Jesus calmly paused to take a drink and allow others to go on ahead. He then melted into the middle of the procession. At the town gate, in his usual place, sat a man called Bartimaeus. He was blind. He was begging for enough food to see him and his family through another day. He had sensed the excitement in Jericho, but as usual, nobody thought to tell him what was happening. When a third pair of hurrying sandaled feet slapped past him, he asked what was going on and was told, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing through." Bartimaeus could not conceal his excitement. He'd heard plenty of stories about this Jesus and how he'd made blind people see. He waited impatiently for the famous healer to come, confident that his days of blindness, humiliation, and poverty were at an end. Those at the front of the Galilean travellers, meanwhile, were swelling with pride as they realised the fame and popularity of their rabbi. They were usually considered with suspicion by wary southerners, but today, with Jesus in their number, they were welcomed like a homecoming and victorious army. This was a moment to be savoured and remembered. As they approached the town gates, the cry of a blind beggar shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," was not what they wanted to hear. As each group passed, they shushed at the man whose voice was raised over the murmured conversations of the people. But the more Bartimaeus was told to be quiet, the louder he shouted until his voice carried down the road to Jesus. The son stopped and asked for the caller to be brought to him. Those at the gate soon received the message and said to Bartimaeus, "Cheer up, he's calling for you." Bartimaeus was on his feet in a moment. Flinging off his coat, he plunged through the crowd, guided by a forest of arms that passed him from person to person, until he was halted by two firm hands which grasped his shoulders. A voice asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus did not need to ask who it was. It felt to him as if all the prayers he had ever prayed had been gathered into a large bucket and were now being poured over him like a shower of clear water. He smiled like a child and announced in a voice reinforced with honest faith, "Rabbi, I want to see." I looked around the crowd. It was as if every face was a mirror which reflected Bartimaeus' radiant smile, and none more clearly than Jesus himself. "Go," the son said, his face pink with joy. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately, Bartimaeus' darkness cleared, and his first sight in many years was the smiling face of Jesus. The two embraced, the people cheered, and the procession into Jericho continued. News of Bartimaeus' healing raced ahead of Jesus, fanning the flames of excitement. What might have been polite applause for Jerusalem's enemy and Jericho's friend flared into cheers and shouts as the town celebrated the miracle performed at its gate. The Galileans loved it. Jesus was their hero, and I found myself being caught up in their enthusiasm. For every human on that road there was a guardian angel, and every angel rejoiced to see their Creator and Master so energetically feted by these people. The inhabitants of Jericho have never been renowned for their spirituality. Their lives are mostly devoted to the accumulation of money. To angel eyes, such people are faint and colourless, but the arrival of Jesus brought new colour into their souls. This was the greatest act of worship these dispirited angels had ever witnessed in this greedy town, and they were delighted. We passed through the town square and onto a shaded avenue lined with large painted houses. As we entered the avenue, I spotted the steady glow of a man perched in the branches of a tree. I've seen the type before, the cool light of one who prays secretly, someone who has faith they dare not show. Among all the merchants and traders of Jericho, this man stood out to my gaze, and I pointed him out to the sun. Jesus walked up to the tree and stopped, looking up into the foliage. Matthew pushed his way to Jesus' side and whispered into his ear. His name is Zacchaeus. He's the head tax collector here. He's extremely rich, utterly ruthless, and thoroughly hated. Jesus smiled. "Zacchaeus," Jesus called, "come down from there." A short, fat man puffed his way down to the ground, helped by Peter's strong arms. He nodded to Matthew and looked up at the much taller figure of Jesus. "My friends and I," Jesus continued, "would like to have lunch at your house today." "It would be a pleasure," said the breathless tax collector, leading the way through a gate to the high wall that lined the road. When the gate clicked shut, pandemonium broke out on the street. The Galileans were confused because they usually stopped for lunch just outside the town, owing to the fact that the locals neither trusted nor liked the coarse northern crowd. The people of Jericho were enraged that Jesus would spurn their welcome and visit the house of the most despised and notorious inhabitant of the town. Nobody knew what to do, and so they all did nothing. They simply stayed where they were and waited to see what would happen next. Inside the wall, Jesus and the 12 were seated in the cool of Zacchaeus' fabulous marble-pillared villa. As I write, they are drinking imported wine and eating cured meats, food only Matthew has ever experienced before. A welcome change from the usual traveller's fate of dried fruit and stale bread. Late afternoon. The lunch break, although sumptuous, was brief. The pilgrims had their hardest stage of the journey before them and could not waste time. Zacchaeus spent precious minutes in deep conversation with the son, and when the time came to leave, he called out the manager of his household and led his guests back to the small door in his great wall. The Galileans and Jerichites were immediately alert when they heard the door open. But before they could speak a word, Zacchaeus addressed them. "In the past," he declared, "I have cheated many of you in many ways. But today, I have resolved to donate half of my possessions to the poorest people of this town, beginning with the beggars who sit at our gates." A murmur of shock and disbelief spread across the crowd. "In addition," Zacchaeus continued, "all of those of you I have cheated can make an appointment with my assistant here, and he will repay you 4 times the amount I owe you." A great roar of appreciation broke out, and Zacchaeus stood calmly watching the effect he was having on the people who used to hate him so viciously. I watched the tax collector. Here was a man who had explored the emptiness of wealth to its very depths, a man who had acquired so much and knew it all to be worthless. Jesus had opened the door to the elegant prison that Zacchaeus had built around his own life, and now he spoke quietly into the tax collector's ear while the crowd's eruption continued. Zacchaeus smiled boyishly, embraced his dumbfounded employee, and then followed Jesus onto the road. Jesus had invited Zacchaeus to accompany him on the journey to Jerusalem. Once again, Jesus walked on ahead. The meeting with Zacchaeus had brought him great joy, but now his mind turned again to his arrival in the city. Remembering that we had questions still to answer, I joined him. "Oriel," he said as soon as he noticed my presence, "human wealth and worldly power are such powerful positions. I must enter Jerusalem in a way that denies them both." As he walked, Jesus scanned his mind across the heavy scrolls of Jewish scripture that he'd studied all his life, looking among them for a suitable precedent. "Am I right in thinking," he asked suddenly, "that when we visited Mary, Martha and Lazarus a few months ago, one of their donkeys was pregnant?" "I'm sorry, but I don't take much interest in such things." "Yes, I'm sure it was." He thought for a moment, then said, "That's what I'll do. I will ride into Jerusalem on a young donkey." The pilgrims climbed quietly, their minds busied with the simple effort of raising their fragile bodies upwards with each step, drawn onwards by the promise of their holy city with all its history and tradition. As the afternoon proceeded, the line of pilgrims spread out. Jesus was always at the front. The effort of the climb, combined with the notorious danger of the road's bandits, kept the people in subdued mood. Near the end of the journey, as we approached the village of Bethany, Jesus once again stopped to let his loyal followers catch him up. He spoke to the first two that joined him, Bartholomew and Judas. "Go into the village, and in the vineyard next to the large house there you should find a young donkey. Could you please fetch the animal for me?" "Master," asked an anxious Bartholomew, "wouldn't that be stealing? What should we say if someone asked what we're doing?" Jesus smiled at the man's honesty. "The colt belongs to my good friend Lazarus. If anyone asks you, say, 'My master needs it and we'll bring it back this evening.'" The two trotted into the village and Jesus returned to the road, accompanied by young John, who was content to share his master's silence. Behind them, from among the Galileans, began the traditional songs of ascent, sung every year as the pilgrims approached Jerusalem for Passover. Not far along the road we came to the place where travellers wait for one another. The moment that the Jews reach the top of the Mount of Olives and look across Kidron Valley to the temple is a very emotional one. It is a moment that families like to share together, and so everyone slows, waiting for others to catch up. Late Sunday evening. Gradually, the number of assembled Galilean pilgrims grew as the travellers completed the hardest part of their week-long journey. One of the last to arrive was an elderly woman, quite beautiful in her faith and her courage. She was utterly determined to complete this, her last Passover pilgrimage on her own. As she approached the scattered forms of her younger co-travellers, she was greeted with warm applause and shouts of congratulation. In reply, she called out, "Come on, you lot, no time to sit around. We're not there yet." To a chorus of groans, the stiff and tired limbs were pressed into action once more, and as they did, Bartholomew and Judas arrived, pulling Lazarus's young donkey. The people looked on, intrigued as the nervous creature was brought to Jesus. For a moment, I wished that I'd called for Hagog, our donkey expert. This creature had not yet been ridden or put to work and looked like she might bolt at any moment, leaving Jesus covered with cuts and bruises. That's definitely not part of our boss's plan. Judas removed his coat and placed it on the donkey's back, then helped Jesus to mount the animal. Seeing this, the other Galileans quickly understood that Jesus intended to make some kind of public statement by his entry into Jerusalem. They too began to remove their coats and placed them on the road, making a many-coloured carpet for the inexperienced donkey to follow. Before long, the aching walkers had forgotten their tiredness and were caught up in the excitement of the moment. They began to sing again, and this time they sang a song about a victorious king returning in triumph to the city of Jerusalem. The identity of their king was quite clear in the rather ridiculous sight of the tall man riding a small donkey. The animal played its part with composure and dignity, carrying its load along the road into Jerusalem. In just a few minutes, they reached the brow of the hill overlooking the city. Grouped in families, the Galileans stood in silent awe, looking down on the place where, according to their traditions, my boss, their God, chooses to live. Jesus, surrounded by his followers, looked beyond the grand stonework of the temple to the muddled streets of the city. He looked towards the hostility and suspicion that he knew was waiting for him in those houses, and tears welled up in his eyes. "Oh, Jerusalem," he said quietly under his breath, "if only you knew today what would bring you peace. But your eyes are blind." As they surveyed the scene, Michael joined me. He and I saw what Jesus' human eyes could not, though I believe he could feel it in his spirit. The streets of Jerusalem were crowded with opposition spirits, like bees in a hive. I was shocked to see that the queen bee, the leader of the opposition, my former colleague Lucifer, had set up his rebel court in the great courtyard of the temple itself. The court of the Gentiles, built as a place for people of all nations to meet their Creator, had become the headquarters of humanity's most dangerous enemy. I said to Michael, if the son follows the pattern of his previous visits to this city, then the temple is exactly where he'll go first. "I know," he replied. "You must leave your troops here," I instructed him. "To take them into the heart of that," I pointed at the temple, "would bring disaster. Say nothing and do nothing. Tonight we will meet with our boss." Michael went to meet with his militia. The pilgrims began to make their way down the hill again, singing their victory song. Jesus rode into the middle of the crowd, deep in thought. Some Pharisees pushed their way towards him through the crowd and complained at the people's choice of song. Jesus looked at them wearily, comparing their petty legalism with the faithful enthusiasm of the ordinary Galileans. "If they keep quiet," he replied, "the stones along this road will take up their song." The men looked at Jesus impatiently, as if he'd gone quite mad, and turned away. But I reflected that these ancient mountains, formed so long before the birth of humanity, would indeed sing praise to their Creator if they could understand his purpose as he slowly rode past. At the bottom of the valley, the hill climbs briefly until it reaches the eastern gate of the temple. Word had reached the crowds inside that the renowned preacher, Jesus of Nazareth, was riding into the city, and hundreds of pilgrims poured out to greet him. They tore palm branches from the trees which lined the route. Some waved them, others laid them on the ground. All joined in the triumphal song that the Galileans had begun. Jesus, I think, barely noticed the effect his arrival was having. His mind was fixed on the road ahead, on what waited for him inside the temple gate. The court of the Gentiles was indeed a hive of activity. The Feast of Passover is peak season for Jerusalem tourist industry, and there are vast amounts of money to be made, exchanging currency and selling animals for use in the week's religious rituals. Such greed is fertile soil for the seeds that the opposition sow in people's souls, the seeds of choking weeds that strangle faith and love, and ultimately rob human beings of life, destroying their God-given spirits. Jesus dismounted the donkey and asked Bartholomew to tie it up somewhere safe. He entered the temple on foot. The leading priests had emerged from their offices to watch him. They were smug with the rich takings of the Passover season, but also afraid of what Jesus might do to their carefully developed business. They were right to be afraid. Jesus picked up a rope from the floor and walked around the vast courtyard, tying knots in the rope as he went. He has learned something from his 3 years in the company of fishermen. When he had finished knotting the rope, he made his way through the crowd to the tables where the priestly staff exchanged foreign currencies for the official coinage of the temple. He joined the queue and waited, watched by the anxious priests. The leader of the opposition stayed back, confident that he had the sun utterly outnumbered and impatient to see what he intended to do. Jesus reached the front of the queue and the cashier looked up, waiting for him to produce some money. The high priest and his staff floated in their back rows towards the scene, watching intently. Jesus looked at them. "It is said," he began quietly, "this temple is a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it into a convention for thieves." With that, Jesus took hold of all the cash-laden table and threw it on its side. Money of all denominations flew and rolled across the stone floor, causing cashiers, priests, and visitors to dive in, grabbing what they could. The leader of the opposition boomed with laughter at this sudden display of greed and violence. Jesus had not finished. He moved to a table of caged doves and did the same thing. While the people were still on their knees fighting for money, hundreds of white doves escaped their doom on the temple altars and flew back and forth among the commotion. Next came the pens filled with unblemished sheep, especially bred for the Passover meals at the end of the week. Now Jesus employed the rope which he'd carefully knotted into a whip. Within seconds, flocks of liberated sheep were skipping and jumping their way around the courtyard in search of pasture. The other stall holders were hurriedly packing up their goods as Jesus strode purposefully around the market. No table was left unturned. Sacks of coins were grabbed and flung into the mob. Opposition spirits raced among the people, stirring them to greater heights of selfishness and stimulating arguments and squabbling. The religious leaders observed the chaos, numbed by the colossal financial losses they faced. The leader of the opposition watched it all from the top of the great gatehouse, amused and entertained. Jesus himself was calm and determined as his bewildered disciples trotted along behind him. This was no act of sudden fury. He had been planning this moment for years, ever since he first came to Passover as a boy. If the Jewish leaders would not listen to his teaching, he would show them what his Father's kingdom was about, and it was not about returning a profit from his people's prayers. When every table had been turned on its side and every sacrificial animal released, Jesus said calmly, "It's time to go." The donkey was there where Bartholomew had left it, tied to a palm tree near the temple gate, rubbing its side against the coarse trunk. Jesus untied it and led the animal back up the road to Bethany, where he had arranged to stay with his friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Late that evening, tired from their journey, Jesus and his friends were soon asleep after the meal that Martha had prepared. It interests me that despite all the danger that surrounds the Son and presses on his mind, the weariness of his body has a greater influence. I would have expected him to lie awake, considering all the possible cries and confrontations of the coming days. But instead he was asleep within moments, a deep and carefree release brought on by the considerable struggle of bringing his body up from the Jordan Valley into the Judean hills. I must now leave him to his dreamless sleep. I have a meeting with my boss in the temple. As Jesus' mother is also staying in Bethany with Lazarus, I've invited Math to come with me. His insight will be useful in the days ahead.